Paper was like gold in medieval times.
Oh, not tobacco. Sugar.
That everything we thought we knew about the world might turn out to be completely wrong.
In Pennsylvania, a missing persons case quickly turns into a homicide investigation. Only a piece of rope can link a suspect to the murder. Detectives in Washington state discover a family brutally murdered. To expose the killer, forensic examiners look to the victim's own blood. A 13-year-old boy in Phoenix, Arizona vanishes without a trace. With no body and little physical evidence, investigators struggle to make their case. When juveniles commit murder, homicide detectives enter a realm of twisted logic. They turn to forensic examiners to follow the evidence, not the excuses, when promising lives become wasted youth. In this episode, some of the names have been changed. Cambria County lies in the rural northeastern highlands of Pennsylvania. It's a small, tight-knit community that experiences few violent crimes. But on November 6, 1997, Ronald Klotz discovered that his son was missing. He told police that his 15-year-old son, Micah Pollock, never returned home from school that day. He said he and his son were very close, and it was unlike Micah to take off and not check in. Mr. Klotz explained that Micah had come to live with him the previous spring. He had moved to Pennsylvania from Ohio, where he had been living with his mother. Micah seemed happy in his new home and was enjoying making new friends. Ronald Klotz's ex-wife said she hadn't heard from Micah in some time. Though teenage boys often run away from home, Detective Greg Batcher of the Pennsylvania State Police soon learned it was unlikely that this was the case with Micah.
As we began to talk to his friends, they said that he wouldn't do that. They said that he was not the kind of person who would just up and leave. He had no reason to up and leave, and that that's when the suspicion began.
Investigators learned that the missing teenager had recently begun dating a girl from school. When questioned, the girl told police that on the day Micah disappeared, he told her he was going hunting with 16-year-old Andrew Callahan. That surprised her. Andrew Callahan was her ex-boyfriend, and he seemed to resent Micah. She explained that when she and Andrew broke up, she began seeing Micah. But Andrew was possessive and had even threatened Micah on a few occasions. Andrew couldn't seem to let go.
He was very jealous, very demanding of her, and it just, according to her, that he was just, watching her all the time. He did not want her to be with someone else.
She wasn't sure if Micah had actually gone on the hunting trip with Andrew that day. Several days passed with no word from the teenager. Police, friends, and neighbors organized a search of the area surrounding Micah's home. But their efforts turned up no clues to the missing boy's whereabouts. Desperate for a lead, police set up a roadblock nearby and questioned passing motorists. Though it seemed like a long shot, the effort paid off. A man recognized a photograph of Micah. He was in the area a few days before, and while pulled over in his vehicle, he had seen Micah with another teenager. They were heading toward an abandoned strip mine. The boy with Micah carried a shotgun over his shoulder. He thought the other teenager could have been Andrew Callahan. The next day, police and forensic technicians followed up on the lead. They traveled to the strip mines where the motorist had seen the two teenagers a few days earlier. Recent heavy rains made searching the area for clues a challenge. But soon after the search began, investigators found something that seemed out of place. It was a trash can in relatively good condition. Technicians found several red droplets on the can. They tested positive for blood. Investigators preserved the murky rainwater from inside the can for further testing. A search of the surrounding area failed to yield any additional clues. All of the evidence was forwarded to forensic examiners. At the Pennsylvania State Police Crime Lab, criminalist Bruce Tackett first needed to determine if the bloodstains on the trash can had originated from an animal or a human. Using a chemical that reacts to proteins in human blood by turning pink, Tackett concluded the blood was human. But to generate a genetic profile from the evidence, Tackett would need additional samples. The remaining stains were too degraded for a more comprehensive analysis. Though there was a chance that blood was present within the liquid contents of the trash can, he realized that the rainwater had likely diluted it. The only way to extract remaining blood proteins would be to first remove the water from the sample. Tackett poured the liquid into a pan and then placed it in an evaporation chamber. In this dry environment, with an air current passing over the sample, the liquid was slowly removed and the solids became more concentrated. After most of the water had evaporated, Tackett tested the sample to see if there was any blood protein in the residue. He couldn't detect any, but he did find a potentially valuable piece of trace evidence: a single strand of human hair. Though there was no way to confirm whose hair it was, police feared it had originated from Micah Pollock. Investigators returned to the area around the strip mines where they found the trash can. This time, they brought a cadaver dog. The dog signaled to a nearby beaver pond. There, in a shallow area of the pond, searchers found the decomposed body of a young man. The victim had been shot in the back. His ankles were bound with rope and his clothes severely tattered. Through dental records, the medical examiner confirmed that the week-long search for Micah Pollock had finally come to a tragic end. Micah had been killed by a 12-gauge shotgun fired at close range. And based on the bruises and abrasions to the body, the examiner concluded that the teenager had been killed elsewhere, then dragged to the place where his body was found. Now, investigators turned their focus to finding the boy's killer. 16-year-old Andrew Callahan, the last person seen with Micah Pollock, was their prime suspect. With his father present, the teenager refused to answer any questions without an attorney.
Andrew, I have no choice but to arrest you.
Though the case against him was largely circumstantial, investigators placed Callahan under arrest for suspicion of murder.
Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law.
Detectives secured warrants to search the Callahan family's home and vehicles. Almost immediately, they found a clue.
And as we were going up the driveway, you could see something hanging from the back of the vehicle near the bumper. As we got closer, it was obvious that it was a piece of rope hanging from the vehicle.
It appeared to be the same type of rope found tied around Micah's ankles. As the team made their way to the residence, they discovered more rope on the porch. From inside the house, they retrieved 4 shotguns and a bag of hunting clothes that belonged to Andrew. All of the items were sent to the crime lab for testing. Ballistics testing on shotgun pellets is nearly impossible.
Sergeant Badger, may I help you?
And in this case, examiners were unable to demonstrate that the shotguns retrieved from the Callahan's home had been used to murder Micah Pollock. But if technicians could identify even a tiny droplet of Micah's blood on Andrew's hunting clothes, police would be one step closer to tying the suspect to the crime. But none of the clothing samples tested positive for blood.
Some of the results were from the lab.
Though convinced of Andrew Callahan's guilt, police couldn't seem to find a shred of physical evidence linking him to the crime. With the suspect unwilling to cooperate, investigators were running out of ways to prove that Callahan was a killer. Police in Cambria County, Pennsylvania struggled to solve the murder of 15-year-old Micah Pollock, whose bullet-ridden and tattered body was discovered in a remote pond. Though all of the circumstantial evidence pointed to 16-year-old Andrew Callahan as the killer, Pennsylvania State Police had little physical evidence to prove it. Their last hope for making their case fell to forensic scientists at the Pennsylvania State Police Crime Lab. Examiner Bruce Tackett looked for consistencies between the rope found tied around the victim's ankles and the samples collected from the suspect's residence.
When I did the rope comparison in this case, I determined that the ropes were a clothesline type rope. They had a woven or a braided cover over top of a core of fairly coarse man-made fibers. I examined all 3 of those pieces of rope that I had, determined that the construction on all of those was exactly the same.
For proof that all of the samples had originated from the same source, Tackett needed to examine the construction of the rope's core. Under a high-powered microscope, he found that the fibers that made up the core were all indistinguishable from one another.
I was able to determine that those ropes were identical in construction and that the fibers used in the construction of those ropes were the same. So essentially, those 3 pieces of rope were identical.
The rope used to bind Micah Pollock's feet had come from the same source as the rope tied to Andrew Callahan's car.
have all this evidence against you.
When confronted with the evidence, Andrew Callahan decided to talk. He admitted that he had shot Micah while the two were hunting. He claimed that when the shooting occurred, he was tracking a bird as it flew into some nearby brush. He believed his gun was positioned at a downward angle. He didn't notice that Micah, who had been standing some distance away, was in his line of fire. Afraid that police wouldn't believe his story, he said he panicked and tried to get rid of the body.
Of the premises, we have found the rope.
Looking to corroborate the suspect's story, police turned to the evidence for answers.
And found on the front porch.
From powder burns observed on Micah's body, the medical examiner concluded that the gun was no more than 3 feet away when it discharged. And the shotgun pellets that entered the victim's back came to rest near his jaw. The weapon had been held at an upward angle, contradicting Callahan's claim that he had been aiming at the ground when Micah was shot. Police believe that Callahan went hunting that day with only one target in mind.
I got another one over there up on the hill there last year, and there's this
The teenager
down this
who was
way.
now dating his ex-girlfriend. Pennsylvania State Police Detective Greg Batcher believed that after the shooting, Andrew systematically went about covering up his actions.
He purchased the garbage can at the store and then returned to the scene. At some point in time, he also gathered a piece of clothesline from his residence. He took these items to the scene, back to where the body was lying.
But when Micah Pollock's body wouldn't fit in the garbage can, he used rope to drag the body some 400 feet behind his car until he reached a remote spot. 16-year-old Andrew Callahan was tried as an adult. He was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without parole. Police believe that irrational jealousy drove Andrew Callahan to murder his rival. But sometimes, investigators can find no motive at all. A suburb of Seattle, the Woodbridge section of Bellevue, Washington, is a quiet neighborhood. One that is unfamiliar with brutal crime. On January 5th, 1997, a morning 911 call brought Bellevue police to a secluded park. A passerby had discovered the lifeless body of a young woman. A rope fastened tightly around the victim's neck made it clear she had been murdered. Police began searching for any form of identification to tell them who this victim was.
no other visible signs of it.
Lying near the body, they found a checkbook. The account was in the name of Karen White, and it listed a San Diego address. Bellevue police searched through records looking for a Karen White who matched the victim's description. Homicide detective Jeff Gomes found a potential match. A 20-year-old woman with that name and physical description listed a previous address just a few blocks from the park where the body was found. After confirming it was the same Karen White that had been found murdered, Detective Gomes had the grim task of making the notification.
As a detective, one of the most difficult tasks you have is notifying next of kin of a death in their family. I don't enjoy it. It's very difficult to do.
Several hours after the body was recovered, detectives went to the White home. Though several cars were parked in the driveway, the house was dark. No one appeared to be home. detectives discovered an unlocked door. Fearing that someone could be in danger, one of the officers entered the property. The house was eerily silent. It appeared the residence had been robbed. After finding no one downstairs, the detective proceeded to the upper floors. As he approached a bedroom, he noticed bloodstains on the outside of the door. When he looked inside, he discovered the lifeless body of a teenage girl. She had been viciously beaten and stabbed to death. He yelled for his partner to call in for backup. Next, he followed a trail of blood that led down the hall into another room. There, he found another grisly scene. A middle-aged couple lay dead. Their skulls had been crushed, and they'd been stabbed repeatedly. The victims were later identified as 17-year-old Janet White and her parents, Regina and Walter White. They were the immediate family of the young woman found murdered in the park just hours earlier. Forensic technicians began searching for clues to help them reconstruct what happened. All of the victims had been savagely beaten with a blunt object and then stabbed dozens of times in the face and neck. Police photographed and swabbed dozens of bloodstains. The only real clues to the killer's identity were bloody boot prints found on the carpet and one on the back of Walter White's shirt. Though the triple murder at the White residence appeared to be the result of a robbery gone bad, that didn't explain the murder of Karen White just a few blocks away.
Well, just the area around the water tower, the picnic area and stuff, there looked like there's some activity of people being up there, but we don't know if it's related to the crime or not. There's not a whole bunch of stuff.
In a community that witnessed few homicides, police were convinced that finding an entire family murdered in one day was more than a coincidence.
The main question was, are these scenes connected? Was that the same suspect acting in both scenes? Was it a one-time incident where a person killed this family, or was it a serial killer?
Despite the lingering questions, police were faced with the reality that at least one brutal killer was on the loose in the city of Bellevue. And until they could identify a suspect or an apparent motive, police were powerless to stop him from killing again. While searching for answers in the strangulation murder of 20-year-old Karen White, Bellevue, Washington police made a shocking discovery. A few blocks away from where her body was found, detectives discovered that her parents, Regina and Walter White, and her 17-year-old sister Janet had been brutally beaten and stabbed to death in their home. Police focused their investigation on Karen's murder, believing that her killer was responsible for the other 3 homicides. Through interviews, investigators learned that before Karen moved to San Diego to become a volunteer in the AmeriCorps program, she associated with a tightly knit group of teenagers who were part of a movement referred to as goth.
It's young teenagers dressing all in black, painting their faces white, dyeing their hair. They sometimes pretend to be vampires with fang teeth, and they dress the part. Witches, they pretend to be witches.
Police learned that one of those friends had seen Karen the night before her body was discovered. The friend had stopped by the White residence. Karen had come back to Bellevue for a few days to visit her family. That night, Karen wanted to run out and do some last-minute errands before returning to San Diego the following day. After being dropped off at home a few hours later, Karen said she still had one more errand to run. She wanted to see a teenager named David Anderson, who owed her some money. The friend decided not to go along. Police jumped on the lead. Under questioning, David Anderson, a 17-year-old high school student, confirmed he and Karen White were friends. But he said he hadn't seen her since she had come back into town. On the night of the murder, he stated he was at a friend's house all night. He and his friend never left. When asked if he owned any boots, Anderson said he had one pair and retrieved them for the detective. But it was clear that the sole pattern on his boots did not resemble the bloody prints recovered from the victim's residence. Frustrated, investigators continued interviewing Karen White's friends. One believed she had important information. She said that on the night of the murders, David Anderson had been at her apartment hanging out with her roommate. Around 10 p.m., Anderson and her roommate, 17-year-old Alex Barani, decided to go out. She recalled that Alex had something stuffed inside the sleeve of his overcoat. She thought it was a bat or a club. The woman fell asleep a short while later and was unsure what time the two returned to the apartment. Having caught David Anderson in a lie, police turned to his friend Alex Barani for additional information. Alex was cooperative and even friendly with police. He insisted he and David had been home all night. But when detectives confronted him with his roommate's statements, his demeanor changed. Homicide detective Bob Thompson.
His chin began to quiver. He immediately started sweating, and he became visibly nervous. I, at that time, decided, I think this guy did the murder.
Under persistent questioning, Alex Barani unraveled. The 17-year-old confessed to all 4 murders. He said after leaving the apartment, he dropped David Anderson off at his girlfriend's house and then went to the park alone to meet Karen White. He planned to tell Karen that David would be unable to pay back the money he owed her. On his way there, he decided he wanted to know what it was like to kill. He strangled the young woman. Fearing that Karen had told her parents her plans, Alex went to her home and bludgeoned and stabbed the family to death. Alex Barani said he had thrown away his boots that had left the prints found at the crime scene.
You have the right to remain silent.
He was placed under arrest and charged with the 4 murders. Though Alex had confessed to the murders, investigators knew from experience that they still needed to scientifically corroborate his statements. And they were unconvinced that he had acted alone. All of the crime scene photographs from the White's residence were sent to renowned blood spatter expert Ross Gardner in Georgia. Gardner looked to reconstruct the triple murder one droplet of blood at a time.
Most of your forensic evidence tells you who was involved in a crime, but what happened at the crime and how it happened is sometimes very significant. And bloodstain patterns speak to those events that created the bloodstains. They tell us what happened and how it happened.
Using bloodstain patterns observed in the photographs, Gardner first looked to establish what types of weapons had been used in the murders. He recognized two distinct cast-off patterns. The first type of pattern was consistent with having been caused by sharp force trauma, most likely by the blade of a knife.
The size of the stains are very small, and here in particular, very similar to what we saw on the scene. And the reason being is we have a very thin edge on which the blood can accumulate as it's being cast off.
A larger, blunt instrument made the second type of bloodstain pattern that Gardner identified.
If we were to observe a cast-off that is the result of a club or a bloody hand being swung, something like that, we're going to see a significantly different kind of cast-off. We're going to see larger stains, greater volume, and they're going to develop over a little bit wider area.
Next, Gardner set out to understand the sequence of events inside the master bedroom. His first clue came from the tiny bloodstains found on the back of Walter White's t-shirt. Those stains had originated from his wife, Regina. That suggested that she had been the first victim, attacked in the couple's bed while her husband lay sleeping beside her.
The father had his back to his wife as she was being attacked in the very early stages of the blunt force attack, because it was very tiny spatter that impacted on the back of his t-shirt.
To understand what happened next, Gardner entered the coordinates of all of the bloodstains found in the room into a computer database. Then, specially designed forensic software was applied to the data. The location and pattern of the father's blood found next to the bed suggested he was attacked with a knife as he tried to get up. A trail of his blood led from that spot to the foot of the bed, where his body finally came to rest. There, more of the father's blood was found spattered on the walls, indicating he came under attack a second time. Those cast-off patterns had been caused by both a knife and a blunt object.
When we took the combination of all the stains that were found in this corner, it really demanded, there was really no other explanation but that this spatter event was occurring and the sharp force was occurring from the other side.
The stains indicated that the attacker stood in front of the victim's head when beating him with a blunt object, which caused his blood to eject into the scene in a radiating pattern. But Gardner found no blood spatter on the surface of one section of wall. The only explanation for the finding was that there was a second attacker standing in front of that wall. Lastly, the blood evidence showed that 17-year-old Janet rushed to her parents' room, but then was attacked and then dragged back to her room, where she became the final victim. Gardner's analysis was consistent with Alex Barani's confession, with one major exception. He had not acted alone.
Ross.
And investigators believed that Alex was protecting his friend, David Anderson. Police obtained a warrant to search the vehicle David Anderson had driven on the night of the murders. They found a length of rope on the front seat. Forensic examiners concluded that it was the same type of rope used to strangle 20-year-old Karen White. David Anderson was also charged with 4 counts of murder. Police believe that David Anderson and Alex Barani murdered Karen White at the park, motivated by sick curiosity. They next set their sights on the victim's entire family. Based on their complete disregard for human life, Alex Barani and David Anderson were tried as adults. Both received 4 consecutive life sentences. In Washington state, analysis of the crime scene helped expose a second killer's identity. But when police are unable to locate a victim's body, proving murder is much more difficult. In the late afternoon hours of November 10, 1995, Rhonda Mitchie entered the Phoenix Police Department to report her child missing. She hadn't heard from her 13-year-old son, Brad Hansen, in nearly 12 hours. Though Brad was a responsible and loving son, he seemed to be going through a rebellious phase.
He's 13 years old. He was on a bike.
In fact, Brad had been recently grounded, and he was supposed to come straight home after school. After saying goodbye to him earlier that morning, Rhonda, a single mom, went to work. She later learned that there were no classes that day. She called Brad's pager and contacted several of his friends. But the 13-year-old never called back, and his friends hadn't seen him that day. Detective Sally Dillion agreed to look into the case. She was optimistic that there would be a quick resolution.
We thought he'd ran away from home, that he was staying with a friend, and, you know, that in a day or 2, 3, that he would return home.
But after several days went by without a word, authorities several hundred miles away in California were dispatched to the home of Brad Hansen's father. Investigators hoped they would find the boy there. But Mr. Hansen had not heard from Brad in some time. And he was troubled that his son had not checked in. Phoenix police distributed photographs and a description of the missing boy throughout the area. But no clues to his whereabouts surfaced. A search of the desert and mountain areas outside of Phoenix also turned up nothing. Brad Hansen seemed to have vanished without a trace. Police in Phoenix, Arizona continued searching for 13-year-old Brad Hansen, who had been reported missing by his mother. Having uncovered no clues to the boy's whereabouts, detectives began questioning his classmates. Brad's girlfriend, Jennifer, said that on the day he disappeared, she went over to a friend's house to hang out. Brad was also supposed to be there. But when Jennifer arrived at her friend Jeremy Bach's house, she learned Brad was no longer there. He had left his favorite ski cap behind. Then, in the kitchen, she noticed a hole in the wall. There was also a reddish-brown stain on the floor. 13-year-old Jeremy told her that he and Brad had been playing cops and robbers with his stepfather's guns. Not knowing that the guns were loaded, Jeremy said that Brad pulled the trigger, firing a round into the wall. The stain on the floor, he said, was ketchup. Jeremy told Jennifer that after the gun went off, Brad rushed out of the house, afraid that he would get into trouble. He didn't know where Brad went, and he hadn't heard from him since. Jennifer hadn't heard from him either. Investigators arranged to interview Jeremy Bach and his stepfather. Jeremy told the same story he had relayed to his friend Jennifer. But when pressed on specific details, Detective Sally Dillian sensed that he wasn't telling the entire truth.
There were parts of it that we had a notion were probably going to be true, and other parts that you could tell weren't. Times when he would make the eye contact and other times when he wouldn't.
As investigators struggled to figure out what Jeremy was hiding, word came in that another classmate wanted to speak with police. In the principal's office at the nearby junior high school, police questioned one of the missing boy's friends. He believed that Jeremy Bach had done something to Brad Hansen. It was well known around school that Brad and Jennifer were boyfriend and girlfriend. And it was also known that Jeremy was extremely jealous. He also liked Jennifer. And though he and Brad were friends, Jeremy tried to break up the young couple's relationship. According to the classmate, Jeremy had been bragging that he was going to hurt Brad. Investigators feared Jeremy Bach had made good on his threat. But to prove that a crime had been committed, they needed to locate the victim's body.
Kevin's going to meet us down there.
To do that, they struggled to put themselves inside the mind of a 13-year-old killer, one who didn't have access to a car.
We really had nothing, so we tried to figure out what we could do, and the only thing that we came up with is we put him in the trash.
Detectives formulated a plan. Once a dumpster is put out on the curb, it is considered public property in the eyes of the law. 2 weeks after Brad Hansen was reported missing, police returned to the Bach residence. After the trash was put on the curb, investigators confiscated the can and then replaced it with another one. Once the trash can was secured in an evidence property room, Detective Dillian contacted forensic examiners at the Phoenix Police Department's crime lab. As soon as the lid was opened, investigators knew their instincts had been dead on. Large stains and dried liquid pooled in the bottom tested positive for human blood. And forensic scientist Kevin Knapp didn't believe anyone could have survived such blood loss without immediate medical attention.
The dumpster was probably about 2 feet in diameter, and there was probably about an inch deep pool of blood, dried blood, in the bottom of the dumpster. So even without being a medical examiner, in my opinion, it was an awful lot of blood, more than I typically see in a case.
Now, examiners needed to verify that the blood found inside the trash can had originated from 13-year-old Brad Hansen. But there were no DNA samples from Brad to use for comparisons. Knapp had another option to get the evidence he needed.
We all get our DNA from our parents. We get half from our mother and half from our father. So you can look at a DNA profile from an offspring and determine whether or not the DNA pattern from the parents could have formed that child.
When the DNA samples collected from the trash can were compared to the genetic profiles of Brad's parents, examiners found a match. Detectives confronted the 13-year-old suspect with their findings. Now, Jeremy Bach claimed that while playing cops and robbers, his hand accidentally hit the countertop and the gun he was holding discharged. Sending Brad Hansen flying backwards into the wall. he didn't realize that his finger was on the trigger. Panicked, he cleaned up the blood and disposed of the body. For investigators, Jeremy's story stretched credibility.
He had said that when Brad was hit by the bullet that he flew back and he hit the wall. Well, very seldom does someone fly back. That's movies, okay, that's theatrics. Normally when somebody gets shot by a bullet, they drop. So there were things that he was recounting to us that we did not feel were totally accurate.
Detectives returned to the Bach residence with a search warrant. They collected the 2 handguns that Jeremy's stepfather kept in the house, including the .357 Magnum revolver used in the shooting. And though investigators found traces of Brad Hansen's blood in the kitchen, the findings did little to refute Jeremy's claim that the shooting was accidental. As long as investigators were unable to locate the victim's body, proving murder would be difficult. Blood evidence convinced Phoenix police that missing 13-year-old Brad Hansen was dead. Though they had been unable to locate his body, his classmate, Jeremy Bach, claimed that he accidentally shot the boy while they played cops and robbers. In a panic, he said he disposed of Brad's body in the trash. But investigators suspected that Brad Hansen had been murdered out of jealousy. Now they needed to prove it. Police turned to forensic examiners for help. At the Phoenix Police Department Crime Lab, firearms expert Mahesh Patel looked for evidence that could prove whether or not the shooting was an accident.
The scenario that was given to me was that Jeremy might have struck the side of the edge of the table and might have accidentally discharged the firearm.
The .357 was constructed with a hammer block, which is designed to prevent it from discharging if accidentally dropped or bumped. Though incriminating, that didn't prove that Jeremy had intentionally fired the weapon. Patel needed to determine how much force had to be applied to the trigger in order to fire the weapon.
What we do is take a set of weights and hang them from the trigger and keep adding on weight to the end of the trigger till it actually goes off, and that will tell us how much force was required for that particular firearm.
Patel determined that 10 1/4 pounds of pressure was required to fire the .357 Magnum revolver. He concluded that an accidental flinch would not have been enough to cause the gun to fire. The analysis indicated that Jeremy Bach intentionally pulled the trigger. 13-year-old Jeremy Bach was placed under arrest and charged with murder. Authorities believe that Jeremy invited his friend Brad Hansen to his house and then confronted him about Brad and Jennifer's blossoming relationship. Driven by a jealous rage, Jeremy grabbed his stepfather's gun and shot Brad. Jeremy Bach, the youngest person to be tried as an adult in the state of Arizona, was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 22 years in prison. Brad Hansen's body has never been found. Sometimes, juveniles believe that homicide is the answer to their problems. When that happens, investigators and forensic scientists must focus on the facts, which can turn dreams of a promising future into the reality of a wasted youth.